Hello, lovelies. I've talked about this before, probably several times, but it continues to kind of bother me and continues to churn around in my brain. And that is the topic of religion, particularly in fantasy games, but other games as well. So yeah, I've touched on this before, but honestly, the way in which we handle religion in games is a bit shit, isn't it? In most fantasy RPGs, religion is just another flavour of magic. Clerics, priests, druids, whatever you call them, they just sling spells, essentially like wizards or sorcerers, except that they wave their hands in a different way, invoke a god instead of some arcane formula in the language of creation or whatever else. They just do that instead of waving a wand or muttering eldritch nonsense and making weird hand gestures. And in most fantasy worlds, religion is basically set dressing. It doesn't matter that much. Gods exist. Sure, there are churches or temples, holy wars, divine interventions, but none of it feels particularly real. None of it really chimes with or echoes with reality, or even necessarily much of our mythology and history, at least not in the way it was presented in our mythology and history. And it doesn't shape the world in the way that religion often, unfortunately, shapes our world. Clerical magic, religion in fantasy worlds is pragmatic, it's prosaic, it lacks deep, unsettling mystery. The things that make faith such a powerful and often terrifying force in the real world. And it often just boils down to a sort of cosmic vending machine. You do the rituals, you venerate the right god, you donate to the church, and in exchange you get spells, healing, smiting. You can even call down the god for direct divine intervention. There's no faith in that, there's no mystery in that. The demands of your religion rarely weigh upon you, other than maybe, depending on what game and what edition, determining what weapons you can use, maybe. But where's the existential dread? where's the fear of offending a deity that might just decide to wreck your shit for no reason at all, or because you sacrificed the wrong kind of goat, or just because it made a side bet with a demon that you were the kind of person that would put up with it? So, let's have a look at this. Why is it that fantasy religion tends to feel so hollow? What's missing? And what can we do to make it more interesting? I'm underprepared today. I have bullet points, but I'm riffing, which is why I might be a bit clumsy. But let's start with a quote from the great Sir Terry Pratchett, rest in peace. "It was all very well going on about pure logic and how the universe was ruled by logic and the harmony of numbers, but the plain fact of the matter was that the disk was manifestly traversing space on the back of a giant turtle, and the gods had a habit of going round to atheists' houses and smashing their windows." So that kind of encapsulates part of the problem here. The problem with most fantasy settings is that faith, which is the core of our dominant current real-world religions, is completely unnecessary. Faith is belief without evidence, belief in the unseen, the unproven. It is, quite literally, if special exceptions weren't made, insane, delusional. But in your average fantasy world, the gods aren't mysterious. They're real, tangible, demonstrably active. They are manifest, and it's the same for the afterlife. When the gods do actually show up, bless their followers, smite their enemies, and grant very literal divine powers, what's left for you to actually believe in? There's no need for faith or delusion when the afterlife is a confirmed fact, when there are ghosts and you have to hire wandering adventurers to get rid of them. when miracles is just another spell on your character sheet, and when a cleric can just cast Speak with Dead to confirm the existence of an afterlife. And that strips religion of its most powerful and interesting narrative effect. Martyrdom, for example, becomes meaningless if you know that there's a heaven waiting for you. Sacrifice loses its weight. There's no internal conflict, no struggle with doubt, no need for belief when the evidence is right there in front of you, probably telling you that you're behind on your sacrifices this month, and if you don't cough up, your fields are going to be flooded. Faith, real faith, thrives on uncertainty. It thrives on doubt. That's what makes it meaningful and powerful. And without that tension, religion in fantasy settings feel more like bureaucracy than spirituality, which is kind of closer to the old Chinese model, I suppose. It also removes one of the most interesting aspects of religious conflict. In our world, holy wars happen because different groups have different interpretations of the divine, even the same divine, because no one knows for sure what the gods want. But if the gods actually appear and say, hey, stop that shit, Bob over there, he's got it right, Dave, he's wrong, wipe out the heretics, then that tension disappears. Instead of wars over faith that we have for centuries, in reality, you just get divine politics and one-upmanship, which can be interesting, but it doesn't really capture the human struggle of religion. Of course, in reality, all of this is terrible and horrible and monstrous and insane, but it does make for good stories, which is what we're considering here. Part of the problem we have, I think, is that a lot of fantasy worlds, especially ones rooted in Western storytelling, are very much stuck in the Judeo-Christian paradigm and mindset when it comes to gods, even if that's not how the world is presented. There's a kind of default to monotheism or a monotheistic-like structure, even when there's technically a pantheon of gods. There's often one big god, or the gods are structured in a way that reflects Judeo-Christian morality, good versus evil, divine commandments, moral absolutism and absolution, and so on. But historically, that's not how most religions throughout most of human history actually functioned. Take Rome as an example, and one that's probably most applicable to our fantasy games. The Roman Empire had gods for everything. Egypt did too, even more so, even multiple gods for the same thing, but yeah, the Romans had gods for everything. And their religion wasn't about personal faith in the way we think of it today. It was more transactional. You gave offerings, you said the right prayers, you did the right things, and in return you hoped the gods wouldn't screw you over. It was practical, it was political, it was about keeping the right gods happy enough not to wreck your shit with a plague or an earthquake. Greek and Roman cities had multiple temples to different gods existing cheek by jowl, and the idea of religious exclusivity was weird to them. The gods existed, all of them, often even the pagan gods that other people worshipped, who became part of the empire, and even set up temples in Roman cities themselves. Even if you had a patron deity, you might still make offerings to other deities when necessary or when dealing with a particular problem. You didn't have religious conflicts in the way that we do today until monotheism started creeping in and causing problems by demanding exclusivity. And that's a model that could make fantasy religion far more interesting. Gods as a chaotic, bickering, soap opera mess of divinities, venal, proud, self-absorbed, vying for influence, with people hedging their bets between different gods, making offerings just in case. Yeah, I don't want that god to do horrible things to me. Here, have a chicken sacrifice. And treating it all with a level of cynicism that feels a lot more human and with an obsession with the mythology and the one-upmanship of the gods in the same way that we subscribe to soap operas. Something else that doesn't get explored much in fantasy RPGs is the idea of divine rulership. We get priest kings here and there, but they're usually in service to a god. But what about actual god kings? The pharaohs in Egypt were literally considered gods. Their divinity wasn't a metaphor, it was taken as fact, and then when they died, they transitioned into the divine realm, becoming another god in Egypt's sprawling and self-contradictory pantheon of gods. So there's that, and even in the Western Judeo-Christian tradition we had this idea of the divine right of kings, that kings were at least in part appointed by God and came from special bloodlines that were close to God, and it was from God that the legitimacy of their rules stemmed, right up until pretty much we chopped the head off one. But what if a ruler's godhood was real in a fantasy setting? What if worship itself made gods and maintained gods? What if an emperor, through sheer devotion of his people, actually ascended to godhood? And that's a far more interesting take on divine power than just you have to reach level 20 to become a god. Imagine an empire where refusing to worship the emperor wasn't just treason, it was heresy, and no other gods were allowed. Where the divine ruler needed constant praise and belief and worship and sacrifice to maintain their godhood, lest they start slipping back into mortality. In those circumstances, a revolution or a heresy is far more pressing than it would be in real life. A setting where kings and emperors literally become gods, and where the act of worship is an active world-changing force rather than a kind of passive, half-hearted belief. The point I'm trying to make is that religion in fantasy worlds is often an afterthought, even for people who play clerics or paladins. It's a mechanic, it's not a philosophy. It lacks complexity, doubt, and all the messy, fascinating aspects that make real-world religion such a driving force throughout history. Now, personally, I don't think we need more faith or spirituality in our actual real lives. I think it's been a blight on humanity. So if anything, we could do with less of that nonsense. I don't think it's a necessity for humans to have a spiritual side. But in fantasy, the inability to think beyond the kind of generic gods exist and do magic approach leads to dull storytelling. The best religious narratives come from uncertainty, from faith in the unseen, from blind belief being tested, sometimes rewarded, but you're never quite sure whether it's a coincidence or not. Maybe punished, but again, you're never quite sure whether it's coincidence or not. It's about the conflict between reason and belief, between Homo sapiens and Homo fides, about devotion in the face of doubt, about faith as a virtue and a vice, and a driver of conflict. Back to conflict again. And if we want our fantasy worlds to feel richer, more alive, and more human, if we want them to resonate with our experiences and our history and our real mythology, then we need to start treating religion with the same care and depth as we give to politics, history, and magic in our realms. But I think just the fact that we live in the modern world where religion is much less relevant than it once was makes that difficult. But it is something worth doing, and it requires player buy-in as much as it requires games master or game creator buy-in. Anyway, something to chew on. Zang.
Flick pig. There's no big story to this, even the title's just a way to get away with writing fuck pig. It's not some earth-shaking attempt to thrust upon you the evils of meat-eating. I eat meat because it's fucking delicious. David Cameron got me thinking about pigs. Then I got into some arguments with vegans. Then I made a horror dungeon game in which you play pigs trying to escape a horrible, fantastical slaughterhouse. That's about it. If that upsets you, do one. A print and play OSR dungeon crawl with pigs. available at post-mort.com and drive-through RPG.